Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and welcome to this very special presentation of Buster Keaton's The General from 1926, one of the greatest and most famous silent films ever made. I am joined by a very special guest today. He is a film historian and author of the book Buster Keaton, A Filmmaker's Life, Mr. James Curtis. How are you doing today, James?
Fine, Ryan. How are you?
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is actually a special presentation because this has never happened before in the history of the series. We are actually showing a film tonight that I have never seen before. So when we're watching it on the big screen, I will be there in the audience enjoying it with the rest of you guys. But it's such an important part of film history. It's such a famous film. Now, Mr. Curtis, Buster Keaton is one of the greatest silent comedians, one of the greatest stunt actors, and maybe even action heroes of all time. But he had directed several comedies, both short films, one reelers, two reelers, and many feature films. So by the time you get to The General in 1926, this is far from his first film. Why is it so significant in Keaton's career?
Well, because it's the most ambitious, I think, comedy feature in the silent era. Nothing else comes close to this. It expresses a great level of ambition on his part to carry this out. He wanted it to be true to history and at the same time, based on a historic event. But he also wanted to have a feature that had great scope, had a lot of adventure to it as well as comedy. He was keeping a lot of the balls in the air at the same time, and he had co-written it and was directing it as well. Clyde Bruckman has a credit as co-director, but he really didn't direct too much. It was Buster was in full control of this film from start to finish, and it has a great authenticity to it as a result of that. He was quite adamant about making sure that the film looked good, that it had a historic flavor to it, that it was accurate as much as possible. And in that respect, it looks like one of those photographs that we see of the Civil War era. It's got that level of detail and charm, and at the same time, authenticity to it.
I'm sure. So Buster Keaton, like a lot of his contemporaries, he had a background as a childhood actor on the vaudeville stage.
Well, he was with the Family Act until he turned 20, and at that point, it really had run its course. It was about 1915, 1916. And so he decided to retire the act over his father's objections, but he was the star of the act, Buster was. So it was time for him to move on. He went to New York and he was going to become a single in vaudeville, and actually got a job on the legitimate stage. One of the summer reviews the Schuberts put on called The Passing Show, and Buster was going to go into that. He was waiting to start rehearsals on The Passing Show when he ran into Joseph Schenck, whom he knew as a booker and talent coordinator in vaudeville. Joseph Schenck had booked the Three Keatons, which was the family act that Buster was involved in. So he knew Schenck, and Schenck was at that point gotten in the movies. He married Nomer Talmadge, who was one of the most popular female stars of that period. And he had hired Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle to appear in two real short subjects comedies away from Senate. And so they ran into each other on the streets of New York City, and Joe Schenck mentioned that they were going to start filming the first Fatty Arbuckle comedy in a couple of days, and would he like to come down and just watch what was going on and maybe appear in a scene or two. And Keaton had virtually nothing else to do other than go to shows at that point. He said, sure. He was always fascinated. He had the kind of mind of a symbol. He could have been a civil engineer in another life. He had that kind of mind to him. So he went down. He's fascinated by the process of movie making, and he got into the film. He, as a result, pretty much was in most of the scenes in the film, and that became his first time on screen, and he loved it. And I'll tell you how much he loved it. As a matter of fact, he was going to get $250 a week from the Schuberts for the show he was waiting to go into. He was paid $40 a week by Schenck and Arbuckle, and he chose to go with them rather than the Schuberts. So
Wow.
that's how fascinated he was. And they ended up making 5 Arbuckle comedies in New York City, 1917, and then they came to California, and they set up out here, Long Beach, not too far from where I'm sitting right now.
Mhm.
And Keaton was with Arbuckle until Arbuckle moved into feature comedies in 1920, and Keaton took over his slot in terms of starring in two reel comedies, and again for Joseph Skank. And Keaton's first film was One Week, and it still today plays great with audiences and is a two reel comedy classic. So that's how he got going.
And where was the shift? Because obviously, especially in the silent era, there's nothing more important than an actor's face and body language because those are all your tools. That's all you have to work with. And of course, Keaton was famous for both. He was his nickname, I believe, was the Great Stone Face because of his eyes, his very serious expression, contrasting with these increasingly ridiculous situations he finds himself into. There's of course that, and this daredevil physicality. When did he develop this fascination with these high concept stunts?
Well, I think he had a natural sense of what to do on the screen. In other words, a lot of comedians would make the transition from stage to screen, and they would essentially do the same business on the screen that they could do on stage. In other words, you weren't really, in Keaton's mind, you weren't really fully utilizing the capabilities of the camera and the screen by just simply doing your stage stuff on screen. And so Buster, from the beginning, had a sense that you did things with the camera that you could not accomplish on stage. That's how he got involved with using, for instance, trains. He loved trains, big train nut, and he used them often in films because you can't put a train on a stage.
Right.
So, so things like that were important to him. And so when he got involved in doing elaborate stunts, there's a waterfall sequence in Our Hospitality, for instance, things like that you couldn't do on stage, at least not to his satisfaction. And so he had a natural sense of that. Let's not do it if we can do that on stage. Let's do this instead because we can't do that in another medium.
Yeah.
And that's the way his mind worked.
Yeah. And it's certainly to the audience's benefit because here we are over 100 years later from when he got started, and you have action stars, you have movie producers and directors, they're still stealing from Buster Keaton's work.
Yeah, absolutely. And rightfully so, I might add, because he was certainly an influence on his generation, on subsequent generations. And again, today you can find people who are in films that admire and see Buster Keaton as an inspiration.
Yeah. So what does our audience have to look forward to in the next 78 minutes?
Well, as I said, it's the most ambitious feature comedy of the period. What you're going to see is a film that I advise people to approach it as a drama with comedic highlights because there's a lot of serious stuff in the general. People, if they approach it as falling down funny slapstick, there is stuff like that in the film. But it's also a very serious topic that Buster was careful to tell correctly in accordance with history. There's a point at which, because his character moves behind enemy lines, that he kind of passes off of the historic story and into his own scenario for the rest of the film. But there's a great deal of it that comes from history. That he was very proud of the fact that he told the story, which is the story of the Andrews raid that took place in 1862. Very much the way it occurred, and you'll see an awful lot of effort involved in putting it across as a real spectacle because it was at the time, and it had to be on the screen as well. He spent more money on this film also than he ever spent on another feature film. So there's a lot to it that you wouldn't see in another Buster Keaton film. And as that is the case, it makes a lot of the best list when you're compiling great comedies of really old time. And
Yeah.
even the Sight and Sound, poll that takes place every 10 years and started back in the early 60s. No, wait, it started in the 50s. The General has been pretty consistently the highest rated feature comedy of them all.
All right. Well, we can't wait to watch it. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of my conversation with Mr. Curtis. Jim, thank you so much for your time. Without further ado, from 1926, co-directed by Buster Keaton with Clyde Bruckman, The General. Wow. So you had mentioned earlier, I can't remember if this is off camera or not, that Buster Keaton, he had that attention to detail and authenticity. You look at these images, they look like an old Civil War daguerreotype
Hmm.
print or
Hmm.
something. So, and
Yeah,
that's,
Matthew
yeah.
Brady, or the images of that time, and I think he was conscious of that. I think that's one of the things that he wanted to get across is the authenticity of the settings.
Hmm.
The film was shot over 2 months in Cottage Grove, Oregon.
Hmm.
He was going to shoot in Georgia. He wanted to use authentic locales, but it just didn't look right to him. And they found this little town up in Oregon that was perfectly suited to film a feature like this.
Hmm.
Logging town, so they had the track, they had the engines, the support system in place where they could get supplies, lumber, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of good things about it. So it was a perfect place to make a film like The General, and great marriage of project and filmmaker and location.
Well, it looks incredible. So one of the key stunts in the film is the train crash or the wreck on the bridge. Was
Yeah.
that miniature work? Was that model work? How did he go about creating that?
No, he instinctively knew if he tried to do it with a model on the big screen, it wouldn't look right.
Mhm.
That's a full size train.
Wow.
They built that bridge just for that shot, and strategically placed dynamite underneath it to help it collapse at the right moment. But it was quite a tourist event. A lot of people came to watch the train go into the water, but as you can imagine, they had one chance to do it right.
Yeah.
And a lot of tension involved in setting that up. Probably the most expensive single shot in the entire silent era was that shot with the train going into the water. And then, of course, they had to have the soldiers wade into the water just after that. Everything had to go correctly, and uh, they couldn't stop. They couldn't. They couldn't stop to reset it. Once it got into the water, that was the end of their opportunity.
Right.
So,
Do you
so
know?
it was quite an occasion, and he he
Yeah.
he did it correctly. He did it right.
Do you happen to know how many cameras were set up just to get it right in case something went wrong?
Five,
Five.
five.
Yeah.
Mhm. From different vantage points. Again, they all had to. It's there's that old joke about Cecil B. DeMille staging this big one time only scene, and he used one camera, and at the end of this elaborate action, uh, DeMille allegedly called out, "Well, did you get any?" And the cameraman looked back at him and said, "Ready when you are, CB."
Oh no.
So that's apocryphal,
Yeah.
but still, that's the sort of thing that you don't try twice.
Yeah, you definitely want to get it right. Now, one of my personal cinematic heroes who I've grown up loving, of course, is Jackie Chan, and I know he's cited Buster Keaton as an influence, and
Big
this
influence. Big influence.
Oh, absolutely. And I love seeing the outtakes on all at the end of the film. He has the blooper reel essentially where you see all or you'll see one major stunt, say he's falling off a clock, which is Harold Lloyd influence right there. You see it shot from like three different cameras, you see three different takes. And I mean, anytime you're putting your life at risk like that, you obviously want to get it right the first time and you want to make sure you have the best angle possible.
Right, right. Well, Buster wasn't so much a daredevil as someone who was a great technician, and his attitude was, "I'm not risking my life here. If this scene comes off according to plan, it's not dangerous.
Yeah.
If somebody screws up, if something goes wrong, then it's dangerous."
Mhm.
But he was a perfectionist about setting these things up. He wasn't interested in getting injured. He wasn't interested in getting killed.
Of
And
course.
he had the physical skill. He actually was very well regarded by stunt people. His attitudes towards stunt performers were that they were great technically, but they weren't funny.
Yeah.
And so there were times when he would actually substitute for a stuntman to do a stunt for somebody that needed it to be funny as well executed. And he did that off and on throughout the silent period. He would just put on somebody else's costume and go do it.
Oh, wow.
And he was only doubled once in the silent era, and that's for a pole vaulting stunt in college. The film
Okay.
made after the general. He hired a Olympian athlete to do that because he did not have time to stop the film for 6 weeks while he learned how to do it. But that's the only time I'm aware of where he actually needed a stuntman himself. Otherwise, he did all his own stunts.
Oh, wow. So, as you said, this was the most ambitious film he made up to this time, and it was the most ambitious ambitious comedy of the silent era.
Yes.
How was it received in 1926 by audiences?
It received well by audiences. It got a mixed critical reception. Some people loved it and praised it highly. Others did not like it as much because they were expecting something that was fall down funny every minute. And this is more of a story into which you inject a lot of comedy. Um, I think what happened ultimately was people were thrown initially as to what to expect. If you call the
Yeah,
film general, people expect him to be, dressed as a general and commanding troops and that sort of thing.
yeah,
And that's not what it's about. The general is the train that's been stolen. So it took people a while to understand what was involved with the film and what it was about in effect. And so it had a long life, but it had a slow start. You can go back and look in the papers and see that it was still playing in theaters in 1929, 2 years after its release. So it had it had a great audience over time.
yeah.
It was never far out of anybody's mind in terms of being one of the great films of the silent period. And thankfully, it survives in very good copies, and so you can see it these days, especially in really pristine shape, which is not true of all silent features of the period if they exist at all.
Yeah.
Um, so it's one of those films that's been around consistently. It's been honored consistently. It's and it was profitable. The legend that it lost money and kind of started uh, the decline of his career and his independence is not true.
Yeah.
It was profitable. It wasn't extremely profitable because it cost so much. It cost $430,000, I believe. It was a lot of money for a silent comedy back
Hmm.
then. But it did fairly well ultimately. It just took time.
Yeah. And now there is sort of a misconception, I'm sure there's some basis to it. Now, Buster Keaton's one of those figures we heavily identify. He was incredibly prolific with films of the 1920s, the silent era. Um, but then when sound came in, people get the impression, okay, well, his career was dead after that, he disappeared. But he lived through the 1960s and he still popped up in the 50s and 60s on various television shows and other films. But
Yeah.
what happened kind of in that middle period in the 1930s and 40s?
Well, he went through a terrible period where a lot of things converged on him at once. His wife divorced him. His career went south on him. He got in a bad way with Louis B. Mayer, who ran MGM.
Mm.
Buster Keaton was a profitable commodity at MGM, and Irving Thalberg, who was in charge of production, valued Buster Keaton very much, and he kept Mayer away from Keaton. Keaton misbehaved quite a bit during that period. However, he wasn't happy with the kind of scripts he was given. He made one really good talking feature and one fairly good talking feature. Parlor, Bedroom, and Bath being the really good one.
Mm.
Doughboys being the pretty good feature.
Yeah,
The rest of them were varying degrees of sad to awful. And he was still profitable when he was fired by MGM in 1933.
yeah,
So he really hit bottom. He drank himself out of a career in effect, as well as a marriage. But he got back into short subjects about 1933 and was given his head. He was not interfered with very much. It was for a company called Educational, and Buster Keaton made a series. How many of them are there? About 12, 15 of them,
yeah,
where he was pretty much in control. And you can see those on YouTube now. And some of them are awfully good. And slowly he transitioned to behind the cameras. He directed a few things. He wrote a few things for people. And he got back into films pretty much through television. the late 1940s. He was brought into television, and he liked what was capable of being done with television.
Mhm.
He had his own show for a while, guest
Yeah.
starred a great deal, and proceeded to make movies again. Kind of as a featured attraction. He's in Sunset Boulevard for one memorable scene.
Mhm.
He's in a good number of films, and I remember him when I was a kid. He was in the Beach Party films, some of those,
Oh yeah.
with Frankie Avalon and Ed Funicello, and he was in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. He was in Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. He made a lot of commercials that you would see on television. So he was quite active. He was very successful in that regard, and he fortunately lived long enough to be celebrated on an international scale. He was invited to film festivals where his films were shown. He was cheered as a result of that. He was a heavy smoker, and eventually he died of lung cancer. But he was really on an upward swing at the time of his death, and he was appreciated once again for the great contribution he made to films and film history,
Yeah.
and being one of the great filmmakers of all time. Let's say it that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's certainly good that he lived long enough to see that appreciation and love from audiences
Yeah,
at
it
that
is.
time. Now, I know this is something that's usually overhyped, and I'm sure this comes more from like schoolyard conversation and the fanboys. It's always fun to pit legends together, like, okay, who's better, Karloff or Lugosi, right? The big one, of course, is Chaplin versus Keaton. I mean, was this something that was kind of in the public's eye during the height of their careers in the 20s and early 30s, or was this something that sort of developed after the fact?
I don't think I never came across any evidence there was much discussion about that in the 20s. They were very different performers. Their characters were very different.
Mhm.
They were both equally successful artistically at that time. Chaplin stayed with silent movies, as we know, until 1940.
Mhm.
He made two silent features well into the talkie period, the last one in 1936.
Yeah,
Keaton embraced sound. He just disliked the idea that you were supposed to talk as much as possible.
yeah,
That was pretty much the attitude in the early days, especially. And his attitude was, we talk when it's necessary. We don't go out of our way to talk. And
yeah.
so he had the right idea. And if you see the films he had some control over, like the educational shorts, he doesn't talk much.
Mhm.
Um, so he knew how to handle it.
Yeah.
And Chaplin, I think, and Keaton, as a kind of which do you prefer and who was greater sort of discussion, really developed with film writers in the 50s and 60s and 70s. These are people who would program and write about who was better, and it wasn't something that occurred to either of them. In fact, they got together for one sublime sequence in Chaplin's Limelight, where Buster Keaton and Charlie do a little, what is it, about 7 minute sequence where they're playing a couple of down on their luck musicians giving a recital. And they're terrific together. They had a great time together. I don't think Chaplin was ever particular. I know Keaton was not feeling the least bit in competition with Chaplin. I think Chaplin considered himself above everybody, perhaps including Keaton, but they got on very well together and they considered themselves friends.
Well, that's good. That's good. So, when we talk about Buster Keaton's influence reverberating even through today, it was recently announced that Rami Malek has been cast as Buster Keaton in a biopic miniseries.
Yeah.
And to everyone's good fortune, they're using your book as the basis for the series.
I just happen to have a copy here. How about that?
Oh wow, what a gorgeous cover. So obviously I'm sure you're a lifelong fan of Keaton. What was your impetus for writing this definitive biography?
Well, my publisher mentioned it to me, and none of the Keaton biographies had really come to be regarded as definitive. The one that covered everything and covered it as well as it could be covered, and so I set out to do that definitive biography, and I think we nailed it this time.
I'm sure everyone in the audience is looking forward to picking up a copy.
Let's
And
hope so.
yeah, yes. Well, Mr. James Curtis, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure indeed. Thank you for asking.
And for you guys in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. Please be back at 7:30. We are following this up with one of Charlie Chaplin's greatest masterpieces as well. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you soon.